Welcome to tonight's Bandung Community Conversation. I'm Lisa Gold, the Executive Director of the Asian American Arts Alliance. A4, we are a 40-year-old art service organization dedicated to ensuring greater representation, equity, and opportunities for Asian American and Pacific Islander artists and arts organizations. And we are one of the co-founders of the Bandung Residency Program, along with my colleague, Amy Andrea, the Executive Director of MoCADA, co-founder of the Bandung Residency Program. Amy?
I'm always stuck when we start this, and I don't understand why, because we've been doing this quite a few times now. My name is Amy Andrea, and I'm the Executive Director of MoCADA, which stands for the Museum of Contemporary African Diaspora and Arts. And we are excited to be in great company today, presenting this Bandung Community Conversation. But just to speak a little bit about MoCADA, MoCADA turns 25 this year, which I'm really excited about. We are an organization that started off in Bed-Stuy by Lori Angela Cumbo while she was exploring and investigating whether an African arts institution could support neighboring Black communities socially, economically, politically. 25 years later, we are still doing this work and deepening our practice across social justice platforms. I will kick us off by talking about the Bandung Residency. If you're not familiar, the Bandung Residency was started actually by my colleague Lisa Gold, who then invited me in. But essentially, the Bandung Residency is an opportunity designed to uplift the work of organizers, artists, educators, and waymakers, whose practice is intended to foster solidarity between Black and AAPI communities. Inspired by events that deeply impacted our communities, including the Stop Asian Hate movement and the Black Lives Matter movement. This program takes cue from the first large-scale Asian, African, and Afro-Asian conference, also known as the Bandung Conference, which took place in 1955 in Bandung, West Java, Indonesia. Similarly, the Bandung Residency aims to cultivate a dynamic safe space for a diverse cohort of change makers interested in engaging in social justice discourse, restorative healing, cultural placemaking, expanding the narrative between communities, and cross-community allyship, whether participating in the program for their personal transformation or in service to the communities identified or both. Thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I will read a bit of our land acknowledgement. 1 second while I find my place. Ooh. We acknowledge that this country would not exist if it wasn't for the free, enslaved, and indentured labor of people of color. We honor this legacy knowledge, and skills stolen due to violence and white supremacy. While the movement for justice and liberation is building and we are witnessing the power of the people, many of us are still being met with violence in its many forms and manifestations every day. We offer this land recognition and solidarity with Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island in the efforts and deliberate intentions toward decolonization. We acknowledge the land of Turtle Island and that it was never meant to be owned. We recognize that most of the land that was entrusted to the Indigenous people was in some cases shared by choice, but all too often taken by force. We recognize the historical colonialism and the ongoing colonialism that has led to the present day situation where land acknowledgements are offered in place of land. We acknowledge the land of Turtle Island that sustains us, express deep gratitude to its Indigenous people, and pledge to honor our dignity and divinity that ultimately connects us all. We recognize that we occupy land originally and still inhabited by the Lenape people. We honor and pay respect to their elders and descendants, past, present, and emerging, as they continue their stewardship of these lands and waters. Thank you. Lisa?
Yes, thank you, Amy. So tonight, like Amy said, we're very excited to welcome Betty Yu, who's going to share some stories and experiences about her organizing work and her efforts in building coalitions. So if you have questions as we go through the discussion, you can drop them in the Q&A box, and hopefully we'll be able to answer at the end of her presentation. For those of you who don't know Betty, she is an award-winning filmmaker, a socially engaged multimedia artist, a photographer, and an activist who was born and raised in New York City. She integrates all sorts of different disciplines: documentary film, installation, new media platforms, and community-infused approaches to all of her projects and practice. Her work has focused on labor, immigration, gentrification, abolition, racism, militarism, and transgender equality, among many, many other issues. She is a co-founder of the Chinatown Art Brigade, which is a coalition, a cultural collective using art to advance anti-displacement fights. And her documentary, Resilience, was about her garment worker mother fighting sweatshop conditions. And it's been screened at numerous film festivals. Her work has been shown in venues all across the country, actually around the world, from the Queen's Museum to Maxi in Rome. And she has a BFA from NYU's Tisch School of the Arts, an MFA in Integrated Media from Hunter College, CUNY, and a New Media Narrative Certificate from ICP. And she has a book, forthcoming photography and art collage book called Family Amnesia that's going to be released in the spring of next year. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Betty.
Thank you for that introduction. It was very generous of you. So this is, it's really, thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really, really honored to be in this space. I know there's other folks out there. I see the four other lovely faces here. I know we're going to open up the conversation later and hear from residents, but I'm really, really honored to be here. So you're probably not going to see my face for a little while. I'm just going to share some slides because I think visual aid is always like the most compelling way to tell at least the story about my own work and the work of Chinatown Art Brigade and the intersection of art and activism, and particularly as it relates to the coalition work we've been doing, collaborative work that we've been doing for some years now. So as Lisa was saying, it's hard for me to see the chat. And so if you can please like jot down questions or I guess put it in the chat and I will see it later, but definitely not ignoring you. It's just hard when I'm in full screen mode. So I am going to dive right into it. I'm just prepping my slides here. Sorry. And let's see. And someone let me know when I should stop talking if I've like talked more than like
no problem. Yeah, I'll be
40
time
minutes.
check for you.
Okay. And
Thank
I
you.
will yeah, I will try to be mindful too, because for some reason, yeah, the chat usually is like hidden for me, but I will also be very mindful.
No problem. At the end of your presentation, I'll be reading off questions from the chat if there are any.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay.
No problem.
So I'm going to say share and then, okay. I'm going to share my desktop. Okay. Do you see slides here? Hopefully you do.
Yep, you're good.
Okay, perfect. I do have a video to share, and if the sound sounds wonky, I'll just put it in the chat. It's a short 4-minute video later. Yeah, so similar to the work that you all do in acknowledging the land that we literally are standing on. It's a big practice of ours, especially when we're talking about anti-displacement work, justice, social justice work. And so for me, I was born and raised in Brooklyn, and of course, Brooklyn is the home to the Canarsie, which is an ethnic neighborhood and group within the Lenape. And kind of to repeat what Amy was already saying, we must pay respect to the Lenape people, past and present and future, on their continuing presence and struggles on their homeland. So for us, no conversation, a lot of the work that I'll be talking about today, not just about gentrification and displacement, but a lot of the work I've been doing is around housing justice. Obviously, we cannot have that conversation without talking about the land, which is we are all on, stolen, unceded territory of the Lenape here in New York City. So I'm going to go to the next slide. I'm going to bypass that one because you just read a bio. I'm just going to start off by talking about sort of my I'll go in and talk about more sort of, I guess, institutional kind of collaborative work with different movements and organizations and collectives. But I wanted to talk a little bit about my own personal work, what you'll see kind of from my own personal work, the motivation for doing, for me at least, for doing the work that I do in the Chinatown community in Sunset Park and other places around New York City. And it really starts at first with my parents and my family, and then the archives that I discovered of my grandfather's from like literally almost I guess like 85 years ago, 90 years ago, his archive that goes way back. But I will start by showing this photo of my mom. And I, during 2020, I mean, I had been studying photography for a long time, but I had the opportunity to work on a passion project of mine. This is during the pandemic, of course, right before the pandemic. I have been doing a lot of work looking at how gentrification has affected my own family, my own community in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. And through this fellowship, this is the cover of, and FOCO, has a fellowship. They're out in the Bronx, and they have a magazine called New Evolus. And I was very shocked that they wanted to put this photo on the cover, but I really wanted to kind of turn the lens, inward, and really allow people to understand why I care about the issue so much. And so my parents have been here since, the late 70s, early 80s in Sunset Park. And now they've been on they're low income wage workers, but they've been retired. So they're really on a very kind of fixed income. And for them, they don't know, how long they can afford the neighborhood, right? Because even though they bought the home, they pooled money together with a whole bunch of other people, the taxes are beyond imaginable. It's skyrocketed tremendously, and they literally and they they have tenants, but they charge them way below market rent because they've been there forever. And so this is real worry of like, what are we going to do? The neighborhood is literally changing around them. And this is the Chinatown part of Sunset Park. I think folks are more familiar with the Latinx part that is really being hyper gentrified by a lot of forces, international money, sort of like the sort of tech economy, innovation economy. I think the artists that first gentrified the neighborhood maybe 25 years ago have been pushed out themselves. And so, this neighborhood in Chinatown, and the Chinatown part, it's more insidious because it's the people that look like me. It's wealthy Chinese folks, in some cases from the States or from China, who are literally kind of replacing the mom and pop places. And so for me, this photography series was, a lot of just patience on my part and my parents' part, where we, we collaborated on this project. Like what's the story that we want to tell? So obviously have a lot of photos, but for this series, really kind of trying to, definitely upholding them in the most like sort of illustrating their everyday life, but doing it in the most dignified manner that I can, and with utmost respect, because this is obviously my own family and upbringing, but also one of just a microcosm of what's happening throughout the entire kind of community and other working class communities, right, that are being squeezed. And so this is a condo in the back. It's going up right on the block that my parents live on. And actually this was shot in 2019. So there's a lot more actually bulldozing of these 2-story homes, and, cash buyouts, right? People sell their homes. I get it. You feel like, oh, this is a lot of money, right? But, what we know is happening is that these condos are moving in, and it's just it's a part of a larger plan. And then I wanted to look at the internal life, like my whole life growing up. As a low income family, the biggest strain was economics and finances. And so kind of this tension of my parents now as older folks who are in their 70s and 80s as landlords and supers, right? Even with just like 2 tenants, like how is that all going to happen? And so we've been, their children, myself and my sisters, who've had to really figure out what to do, right? Like how to help out, how to help them just maintain, their, just everyday life. And so this is another photo of them just kind of showing their internal life. And then, the other collaborative work I would say is what some of the organizations that I found out until recently were still around, that the archive that I found of my grandfather's from about 12, 13 years ago, which no one told me about. I found them in a basement, 5 photo albums, and it's of my grandfather who I started to discover. I mean, I knew my grandfather obviously has been here, you know, back and forth between China and here since like the 20s and 30s, but of course, connecting the dots and then further looking into and digging into the archive, I find out, really looking at the archive with my father, and that I had a, a great grandfather who came here in the late 1800s to work in Nevada. And of course, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 had everything to do with why folks were not able to stay here and build roots, right? And so, as we know, with many policies, right, racism and white supremacy that has shaped policy throughout history, particularly nativists who are, you know, at this time, right, you know, it's like the othering, right? So it's the Chinese laborers, it's, you know, indigenous folks. It's at this time, you know, obviously, uh, um, folks who were working alongside, you know, people like my great grandfather who were emancipated folks, right? So, you know, learning about how he, you know, most likely worked on the railroads, and there's a story that he might have also been running a legal gambling parlor. But the you know, the solidarity that Asians have always had with people of color, working alongside other oppressed people. And so understanding that history and then connecting it to my grandfather, who ran a hand laundry business, like of 2 people. And I started realizing that I found this archive, and I started talking to archivists and experts, and then further realized that he was actually the co-founder of the Chinese Laundry Alliance of New York, which was a leftist organization. At some point had 2,000 members fighting for the rights of hand laundry workers who were Chinese, because that was one of the only businesses they could work in. And so understanding kind of how all these pieces kind of fit together, and I started to work with the organization. They're not around anymore. And I actually found one man 10 years ago who was in his 80s who knew my grandfather. And it was totally just kind of just a serendipitous moment where he was my mentor. And so I made this short film, and then I basically was able to capture stories. So depending on what you dial, you pick up this phone and you dial, you're prompted to dial a number, and you could hear stories of hand laundry workers and experts and people who are talking about what life was like for Chinese, mainly bachelors, right? Because women weren't allowed to come here. This is for 60 years. What was life like in New York in the 30s and the 40s? And so, you know, fast forward, you know, connecting the dots again to the work of my mom and her organizing work as a garment worker in Chinatown, fighting garment conditions, like illegal, terrible sweatshop conditions, and seeing sort of the through line of labor organizing, which I didn't know about my grandfather, obviously, until very recently. But as folks probably know, in the you know 90s and 2000s, sweatshops was a pretty popular term, right? To kind of maybe folks think about that in the third world, right? But in the global south, but they were right here in Chinatown and New York City. And so with this installation, not only did I want to show garment workers as definitely not as victims, right? But not even just about telling their stories, but a platform for them to talk about how they're actually organizing and fighting back and coalition building and building across the labor movement, across the immigrant rights movement, across the social justice movement. And these were my sheroes. You know, I was involved with organizing early on as a teenager, and I just started to turn the lens on these folks that I really admired, who are monolingual speaking low wage workers in the garment industry. But I was very inspired by them, and so working with them to at that time didn't understand what, you know, oral history preservation and all these things were, but I just really knew that I wanted to capture their stories, because what they were doing was so brave. Because people like my mom, other garment workers, get blacklisted, right? In the industry, especially at that time, where all the bosses were in touch. Everyone knew who was a quote unquote troublemaker. And so this is an installation that honors, like, you know, the garment workers who I interviewed, but workers in general, in this country that are the backbone of society. So depending on how you operate this machine, videos will come up and you'll hear stories. And these are actually check stubs that are copies of check stubs of my mom's on the left here, where you could see that the union shops that she worked with and the non-union shops paid just as poorly, below minimum wage. So you can really kind of see the full picture of what it, what a state, this is kind of like what her station was like. She described it to me, and I try to kind of convey it as best as I could. This video has stories of about 10 garment workers from the early 2000s, late 90s, mid 90s, talking about their organizing. So I'm just going to keep going. So these are various install images. Some of them are from, this was part of the Tribeca, like one of their first interactive media, interactive showcases, the garment machine that is. And this is just from various places. So I'm just going to keep going. That's my mom right there. This is another show in Chinatown showing the work, the culmination of work I've been doing with my grandfather's archive, as well as with my mom as a collaborator, and my dad. My dad is not as communicative, so my mom has often been the one to pass on some of these stories. I want to just point out, if you see the redacted paper with all the black markings on the documents, those are FBI papers that are still redacted to this day. And my grandfather's organization was targeted during the McCarthy era for being communist, and they were summoned to testify, and then none of them really actually gave any information, of course. And sadly, 2 of them took their own lives, and 2 other leaders were deported back to China. And just to show the propaganda at that time of the Exclusion Act, the meetings that these white supremacists would hold, Chinese, no Chinese, that's actually a poster that was sort of largely circulated in the state of Washington when they were pushing for the Exclusion Act to be passed. So for me, it was a real sort of not only of the past and the research, but actually trying to be as accurate as I can with the people who are still living, and through my family kind of history and archive of trying to tell that story. So I'm just going to keep going. And then just a little bit more about my own collaboration with my family during COVID. I used that time. I had the archive, luckily, before lockdown, and I was able to identify certain people in photos. And I started to shoot video and through the photography, being in isolation. And this became a series that has shown at a few places, but like an 8-part series of videos that I just shot over COVID, over in real time, like figuring out who's who in these photos, and then just trying to kind of share kind of the parallel that was happening with the Exclusion Act, with the anti-Chinese, anti-Asian violence and sentiment that was growing at this time. And of course, at its peak in 21, 22, but really kind of reflecting on a lot of that. So this is just my parents. Always for me, the root of my passion for this work is really seeing how hard that they work just to make ends meet, food on the table, and then understanding that my family story is not unique, right? It's the story of so many immigrants and working class families and folks who've been discriminated against because of the sort of institutional, violence and racism. And so this is just more stuff that I've done during COVID. Some stuff is from the book, but just kind of, again, looking at anti-Asian violence, that, as we know, is rooted way back from over 150 years ago. And this is some of the stuff that I was doing, kind of a culmination of my archives and some of the, again, this is like sort of 21, 2020, 2021. This was part of a publication that, Eflux folks probably know, that they put out something with Guggenheim, which is like a architecture magazine. And then these became part of a show at Artist Space, which is part of the ISP program at Whitney. And these are just some of the collages that I've been working on. And then that the book that I think Lisa mentioned and this work was highlighted as a part of Photoville last year. I created a sort of a mock-up zine of what the book was. And kind of, I think we're all, for some reason, kind of a throwback to the zine culture, right? But really trying to, again, draw the parallels to the past and present around racism, and what solidarity actually looks like. And I'll get to that in a second. And that's my son from a year and a half ago. He's bigger than that now, but there's him in his little Adidas tracksuit. And this is some work. Sorry, I don't know why the text got weird, but this is actually at the Brooklyn Museum now, which is a part of the exhibition, the Brooklyn Artist Exhibition. Sorry, I don't know why it's double heading like that. And then this is for now the cover of that book. It's called Family Amnesia, Chinese American Resilience. And this is my grandma and grandpa, pictures of them. And then I'm going to talk about coalition work and collaborative work as an artist and as a filmmaker. And maybe there's some things that can be gleaned from this that are helpful. And I can definitely share the document with you all. These are just some screenshots from the report. So about 2.5 years ago, the Documentary Accountability Working Group, especially on the heels of the sort of Black Lives Matter uprisings against institutional racism and violence, a bunch of folks started to see patterns in not only the Black Lives Matter movement of who's telling whose story, but just throughout, art, culture, and media work, and how extractive, right, it can be without even fully realizing it. So these are just some takeaways that I think are really, really important. Obviously, not just for filmmakers and artists, but people who are doing work where they're collaborating with communities, particularly communities maybe that they're not from. And I just want to share a little bit of that. And I'm from some of these communities, of course, but then it's not a monolith, right? Just because I'm from as we all know, I'm from the Chinese American community, but doesn't mean that I'm automatically embraced, right? And so just kind of like the sort of best practices that this report, which is like a 50-page report, is really interesting. But I'm just going to share a few things because I think they're really helpful. Just like top line things like integrating anti-oppression practices into your own work, whatever that looks like. And I think for us and for Chinatown Art Brigade, which I'll talk about in a moment in my own work, is really just to understand deeply how that shows up for yourself, whether you're consciously biased or not, and how are you kind of considering these things and who should be telling the story in the first place. And as we know, it's not a level playing field, has ever been, especially when this country's the foundation is enslaved people, right, who built this country, and then literally the genocide of Native American people. And so understanding that we're and then us in between, where we're obviously settlers, right, on this stolen land, as like me as an Asian American, and my parents who had the choice to come here. They did come here. They fled China and came here. But what does that mean for us in terms of as storytellers, and myself coming from a place of privilege to a degree? Like, am I the right person to make this piece? And can I do it in a way that doesn't undermine the agency of a person or people or community? And then be transparent with your relationships. And that just means like really just folks should understand, like, if you are, people are smart, we know that, right? And it's like, for me in doing projects, they're already thinking like, where is your funding coming from? What is your end goal? Who are you reaching? Why are you interested in my story? And I think that as much of the mutual kind of like communication and open communication that can happen, it engenders that trust from the beginning, I think. And just to be kind of putting your cards out on the table, is just the transparency goes a long way. And then again, acknowledging your own positionality as someone who might have some more resources, even as a person of color, maybe working with your own community. And they assume that they have the ability automatically to interpret stories, but sometimes that might not be the case. And so challenging our own like preconceptions as artists, and thinking that because we have that skill, we know the skill set, whatever that may be, that we're the best to tell that story. But kind of to just step back and really think about that. And again, this is particularly within documentary, but I think it really applies across the board. And there's a you know, introduction to this whole document that really, you know, acknowledges that this could be useful across various arts and culture fields. And again, respecting the dignity and agency of people, I think in the work, you know, again, like we, you know, and I say I include myself in this. I often say, yeah, of course, but then how does that actually show up in the process of doing the work? And I'm curious what other folks think, you know, as we have a discussion, like what does that actually look like in that agency and respecting the dignity of people's stories and the nuances of it. And then prioritizing their needs, experience of the people associated with your film. So we know that they're their own experts in their experiences and telling their story. And then us, for me, as someone who like does a lot of work in the intersection of like new media, film and photography and video, you know, we feel like, okay, we want to tell it this way, and we almost sometimes prescribe it. But sometimes we have to deviate from that because it's triggering to that person, or perhaps there's another route to tell that story or to create this piece that you think is best, but actually maybe you don't know what's best in a way, right? Because the participants are telling you that this is not actually the way to go about it. That's you know, it's triggering or you know, it's problematic. And then for me, all folks that we work with, especially in the work within Chinatown Art Brigade and even Sunset Park, is, you know, again, treating all audiences with dignity, care, and concern. And so understanding that folks who are trusting you with their story, there's that relationship. And then considering the ways that it can be read or experienced by other people from the community. Not that you can always control how other people obviously are taking your work in, but just kind of to be mindful of that, and that potentially triggering or traumatizing. And so what does care and concern look like in the larger ethos, I guess. And sorry, I'm going to go through these really quick. And then the values, again, around just consider safety issues, right? Like literally safety, whether it's like because someone's a status, documentation status, or someone's formerly incarcerated, someone's being targeted or doxxed, especially right now with all the repression, or maybe they're underage, whatever it is, just kind of always being mindful of those things, because they can often be kind of, what's the word, kind of fade in the background when you've got so many things happening. It can be just kind of a big mush. Considering the filmmaker or the artist's presence in the community. And so, you know, the dynamic that often can carry, and the power dynamic. And so for us, you know, in Chinatown Art Brigade, we've had people at times mistakenly, we've invited people like journalists or filmmakers who will film, and we get the consent from our collaborators, but then the whole entire like dynamic in the room changes. And so we've had to be a lot more mindful of that and be very protective of people's stories and the extractive nature that I think, you know, folks who are coming into the space with all good intentions, you know, it appears a certain way, of course, right? Someone who's not there and then comes in and just parachutes in and out. And then so, yeah, so again, letting people's stories like really drive the direction of the project. I think that's hard, especially when we again have our own view of what it should look like, or our own perception of what it should look like. And always centering the dignity of people in the work. Again, transparency and relationship building is important. And so just again, for us, our relationships with our collaborators and my relationships are really paramount. And so, you know, just letting folks know, like, you know, this is the, you know, compensation that we're getting, not compensation, but funding we're getting for the project. And this is how we're able to spread it around or not, you know, and that kind of thing. Accuracy, that's like, you know, and the last few is, you know, and I'll share, like I said, I'll share this, so I won't go into it too much, but I will just say that this has been very helpful. Number 3, those whose lived experiences are represented in the story told, and in the audience engagement effort. So really centering when you're for us, when we've showed our project, our placekeeping project, our mapping project, which we'll talk about, to the folks who not only help make it, but to the greater community who are tenants in Chinatown and residents. Like, how do we engage with folks, and how do we do that in a way that is honoring their own experience, and doing a way that is like respectful, and we've gone through iterations of our mapping project, and actually the feedback that we've gotten along the way has really been helpful in our iterations that we've done after those sessions, those feedback sessions, and that has been really helpful. And last few things here, number 9, there's small businesses that are in the community. Kind of, I know sometimes it's easier to go to Whole Foods or Trader Joe's, and of course budget will dictate that. But I think for us, lately we've been really trying to be very mindful of the small businesses that often are obviously the backbone of our communities and are taking the big hit because of gentrification, and making sure that we really kind of try to center them, give them business for our events and that kind of thing. I think is really important. I'm just going to keep going here. Again, I'll share this. These are just some glossary terms that this document provides around positionality and transparency and bias. I will hopefully I'm okay with time. I just got like maybe 15 more minutes, if that's okay. And just shout out to me if you need me to stop soon. So Displaced in Sunset Park is a project that I've been working on since 2017. It's ongoing, but honestly, I haven't, in the last year, I haven't captured as many stories. But it's an interactive project that uses augmented reality and storytelling and video to capture the stories of people who are most impacted by gentrification in my neighborhood that I grew up in. So it's the residents, the workers, the small businesses, and the impact that, the sort of gentrification, specifically on one end, the innovation economy and the condos, on the other end, again, it looks different, right? On the other end, which is like transnational money. But these are the stories, and this is a map. This is actually not representing all the stories, but when I actually shared it at a few places, created a map with these stories. And some of the folks I interviewed are people who either grew up back in the day in Sunset Park, still live in Sunset Park, or maybe are like the top right. So who some of you probably might know is Cecile Chong, who's an amazing artist who was a teacher for 25 years. And she talked about seeing gentrification through the eyes of her young students who were in middle school, and how they got teary-eyed and choked up when they talked about having to move because they couldn't afford the neighborhood anymore, move to another state, in fact. And they didn't understand why, but they were sharing that they were no longer going to be around, and so in the neighborhood. So she kind of just talked about that, kind of very present in the neighborhood, because she literally teaches right in the middle, the heart of Sunset Park. This couple, Maritza and Alfredo Lopez, who moved to Sunset Park in the 70s to start the chapter of the Puerto Rican Socialist Party back in the 70s, and saw all the changes, and how now, was from Caribbean to now Latin American and Central American, and then when it was Norwegian and Scandinavian to now Chinese residents as well. And so they talk about the organizing that had happened. So if you were to point your phone to this photo, you get, basically, I'll show you in a second. There's a map that I gave out when people came to 2 of these shows that I had, and a neighborhood walk. They would get this newspaper and they could point their phone to the photo or to the location, and their story would come up about the neighborhood. And this was just a simple Google map that I made because a lot of people were contacting me and saying I actually can't physically go to those places to play the stories, to experience them. And so I created a Google map, and this couple got priced out of their salon in Chinatown, Brooklyn's Chinatown, because their rent almost doubled within a couple of years. That's me, my grandma. So this is a newspaper that this was also part of the show. So personal, and the community kind of for me, again, providing a personal lens, a portal into into why I care about this issue. And so for me, the personal is political always. But this is a newspaper that of the people's stories. And so if you aim your phone at these locations, then it was like a big newspaper, then people's stories would come up. And you were prompted to use an augmented reality, to use the AR app on your phone. And these were the stories. This was in an open source gallery in Brooklyn as a community-based gallery where I showed the work. And actually that neighborhood has been renamed, but it's actually Sunset Park proper, but people call it South Slope now, because real estate developers have changed the name to charge more. And so this is some of my personal stories as well. That was a part of the show. And then archives are a big part of the work. So when I collaborated with different storytellers, people were really insistent on showing photos of the past of the neighborhood and also maps. People kept talking about, well, you know, this neighborhood is called this now because these real estate developers push city council to change, you know, to change the name. And that was like repeated over and over again. Or do you know about this piece of legislation that was passed or that policy around like land, right? And around zoning. And so it became clear to have this corner in this space where people could just explore these archives. And so the top left is photos that Alfredo gave me. He basically, during the height of the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, they filled the Madison Square Garden with 20,000 people, which was kind of amazing. There was a photo of him and Angela Davis, and then to the left of him, you can't see, it's covered by the other photo, but it's Jane Fonda. So anyway, he gave me these archives, and then these became, you know, copies of them, of course, became part of the show that people could kind of see the neighborhood back then and the places of importance to them now and back then. So this was part of the show. And then for me, collaborating with people who are actually doing the work on the ground is really important. So these are organizers, cultural workers, artists who are doing the work in Sunset Park. And then this is a newspaper I'm holding. And then and in the middle is Marcela Montañez, who's actually now a state assembly member, but she comes from the tenant organizing world. You know, so this is kind of a very big part of the work for me, to always kind of for me, it's for me doing this work, video or multimedia work, that's not the end goal. It's to help really bolster and like advance the organizing work. So this is another venue where I had this project, a different iteration where I had these organza banners that were hanging, which are redlining masks. I'm sure you all know what redlining is. And this is based on an article that Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote from 2005, I think, which was called The Case for Reparations. For the Atlantic, or maybe 2015, I can't remember. No, 2005, yeah, or 2008. But anyway, that is such an amazing. It's all in one place. He did all this research, and it's all in one place. So if you ever check it, it's still online. It's an amazing article because it looks at the wealth gap, right, mainly between African American folks and white folks, and housing being the one huge contributor to that wealth gap because of redlining, right? Which dictated where you could live based on race and where you couldn't live and couldn't get a loan. And so this is my neighborhood in a circle, and the only neighborhood that was never redlined, right? Meaning it was a dangerous, bad neighborhood because there were people of color there, was Bay Ridge, because that was white consistently throughout that time. And so this is another install image. Big part of my work is to embody the walk, so do placekeeping walks. I just did one in Chinatown with the Chinatown Art Brigade. And so when you embody the walk and you talk about the places of importance, stories from different residents, it's totally different, right? So we had the newspaper and I showed folks how to use the app, but we started out in the park and then we went to the Chinatown part of Sunset Park. And we were able to bring these stories to life through the phone, and also telling other people's stories that I've captured. And that's a big part. Like, how do I tell those stories in the most respectful way? Because, you know, they all couldn't go on the walk, you know, to lead this walk. And then the last project I'll talk about before I'll speed right to Chinatown Art Brigade is a project we were here on Masking Yellow Peril, which A4 was paramount in making happen, and all of their help. I'm so thankful. But this is a project just really providing a space for people to talk about anti-Asian violence and the roots of it that go way back beyond 2020, as we know, and then how it connects to all the intersection of the issues that we all care about. And so in Flushing, we did a number of storytelling events. This one was in Flushing Hall. I also collaborated with a few other organizations in Flushing, Minquan is one of them. And I work with them and then Nanum House, which is a homeless shelter with a shelter for mainly the Korean community, where we did some other storytelling events as well. But this one was the main one with that was kind of in front of Flushing Hall, and we were able to spread out and capture people's stories through writing, through people answering questions about safety, who keeps us safe. And I think what I learned most out of this piece, collaborating with people who were just random public passerby, and also people I invited, was that people weren't really, there was not an outcry for like, we want more cops to patrol our streets to keep us safe. In fact, that just creates more division between people of color. People were really talking about how do we really keep each other safe, right? Within our communities, we know how to do that. We do not need more militarized streets to do that. We don't need a task force on anti-Asian violence to do that. That people were really understanding what it was very racially coded, and it was pitting people against each other, and criminalizing Black and brown folks. So that was something I really learned a lot through capturing people's stories, whether they were in Chinese, Korean, or English. And so people were just telling their own story, and kind of and people wrote their responses, different stations, interviews. And then we did a projection again with A4's support. We did this projection in the community. Oh, sorry. Okay, there's questions. Okay, I'm going to speed through here. So anyway, keep going. So these were stories that were projected, and then we had a speak out, which is really great. And I'm going to keep going here.
Quickly, is your Yellow Peril project still active, Betty?
Not really. Oh, yes. I'm not that part of the outdoor stuff, but I'm interviewing people. I'm doing like video interviews, but not that public part. Although I'm slated to do one in Brooklyn next year, but it's been on pause for like 2 years now.
Got it.
Since I had my kiddo. It's been so hard. But I do really, 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 really want to continue doing it, because it's not as if any of that stuff stopped, it's just the media has stopped focusing on it. And so that's been really important to me to continue it and figuring out ways to continue it. But I'm just really briefly, in terms of collaborative work, I worked with The Door, which is a 50-something-year-old organization mainly for queer homeless youth. And we worked on something for this show together, and they all wanted to, it was a show about the Artists and Homeless Collaborative from the 80s and 90s, and we wanted to bring it up to date. So through interviews and drawings, like mapping out their future where homelessness is eradicated, through all these different activities and sessions over 4 months, 5 months, we created this poster, and it was augmentable. So using augmented reality, you can tap it with your phone. You can scan it with your phone, and then you can hear people's stories, the folks who participated in this. And so it was various stories that people told, and so you can tap through it, and these are the 4 folks who told their stories. But then you can see it's based on drawings that they did. It's based on their own letters to themselves, their future selves, of how they helped eradicate housing and fought for housing justice and this kind of thing. But I'm just going to keep going with that. And then this is, I'm going to keep going. This is some more collaborative work for Queens Museum, where I collaborated with Minquan and some other housing rights groups, because Flushing, Queens, as we all know, is really feeling it. The waterfront is being privatized. And now the cost of an apartment is like $1.5 million by the waterfront in Flushing. And so this is work where we work together to come up with a timeline and videos and working with organizers to tell the stories. So this is Bobby Nathan, who talks about, he's Jamaican American, and a lot of folks don't know that Flushing was actually had a huge Jamaican community back in the 60s and 70s, and how that was systematically the folks were pushed out, basically. And then we created a resource guide for folks to take action. I'm just going to keep going here. Chinatown Art Brigade. The work that we've been doing started in 2015 with CAB, the tenants union, the Chinatown Tenants Union, and they have been our closest collaborators. They've been around for 40 something years, started as a Pan-Asian organization, but have been organizing tenants since 9/11. After 9/11, the gentrification of Chinatown and Lower East Side really accelerated, of course, and folks have been pushed out in record numbers. The community is still largely low income and elder, and almost all renters, right? In terms of the Chinese speaking population. And even just in the last 10 years, the amount of the loss of rent stabilized apartments, loss of the tenement buildings where, people, it's like single room occupancies. It's just gotten really bad. But this was when we first started, we're on top of a roof of a tenement building where one of the tenants are organizing. Relationship building was key here. Like, we started doing these workshops with folks, but it became clear that we needed to pause some of that and our plans. Like, we had all these like agendas and our, cultural organizing workshop and theory and pedagogy, all of this planned. And it was like, we had to slow down and we had to really listen and figure out what's the point of doing this if we're not actually going to do it collaboratively. And so it was them that came up through story circles and through art making workshops, telling their stories, us capturing their stories. They were very much very, very, very early on said, we need to do projections on walls at night because people are working really long hours and they don't have time to stop and talk to you, even though they're going through tenant harassment. As a tenant, their landlords are harassing them, they're having issues, but people are working 13 hours a day just to put food on the table. So clearly it was through the story circles, building trust, mapping out their stories, and then doing placekeeping walks. So we would do audio recording, photography, video, and capturing people's stories. So Mrs. Zhang on the bottom right here talks about living in the community for 20 years, and a garment factory she worked in is now a condo. So it's like a lot of issues that are like right in the center of her community on her own block where she lives, she worked, and where she's organizing. And so these were stories that we kind of throughout a couple of months captured. This is in front of a restaurant that is no longer there because of union busting, but was one of the first unionized restaurants in Chinatown, through a walk. Mimi on the right is in front of a tenement building, her apartment that she shares with 8 other people in a building where they're trying to kick them out so they can raise the value to market rate, raise the rent. So these are more walks. And so through these walks and mapping, and people just sharing whatever came to them and chalking, writing, like all these kind of different prompts, that we came up with the materials. And this is more mapping for the projections. And this is more workshops that we did. I'm just going to keep going here, around art making. A big part of our work was to actually call in the art galleries in Chinatown, over 120 of them who have gentrified Chinatown since 2013. And it's back to pre-COVID numbers, in fact more now in terms of the galleries that are gentrifying Chinatown. So this was a big town hall meeting we had, and all these people showed up and a lot of galleries showed up. But when push came to shove, it was all talk, right? But there's still an organization called Art Against Displacement that came out of this, a collective rather, that's doing great work. So this is a member of Chinatown Art Brigade who started to map out all the galleries that were gentrifying her neighborhood within her 5 blocks, and then it became a bigger and bigger project. I'm just going to go past this real quick. Sorry. and then show some projections. Again, these are stories throughout our workshops, stories, messages that people wanted to tell. People rewrote a song, a Chinese song, a karaoke song that is really famous, into these pro-tenant, like anti-unscrupulous landlord lyrics. And so people who sang it together, random people actually approached the projection van and started singing with us. And it was a moment to talk to people about this organization and to talk about CAV and Chinatown Tenants Union and what they were doing and what's happening in the community. That's not just happening to one person. It's like, it's actually, you know, a pattern, right? And it's a structural thing. And so this is one of the perfect moments for that we captured, that someone captured, and people were able to write messages that became really large on the wall. This is called a people's pad that the illuminator that we worked with created. And so people just came up with whatever kind of moved them. And this is a pledge that we put out to galleries in Chinatown. So not only as individuals, how can you be good stewards and like protectors of the community, but also what policies, what organizations can you get involved in to actually join the fight? Inviting in, not calling out, but inviting in gallerists as well as individuals who are gentrifiers into the conversation. So, you know, this is another place where we showed our work. Smithsonian, the Asian American Smithsonian Center had a pop-up show, and this is where contradiction happens, right? We didn't know if we should do it, but we wanted to use it as a platform to elevate the work of Chinatown Tenants Union and what was happening right in the heart of where the pop-up show was going on in terms of gentrification. And so this is the mapping project. I'll kind of end off with a few slides of the mapping project, where we started out with a physical map in the office of CAV, Chinatown Tenants Union. We started to ask people, what are your places of importance that you want to honor? What places are no longer there because of gentrification? And through various iterations, we launched the mapping project. And this is with some support from the Laundromat project, which we're very grateful for. And we did a launch, and then the physical map became an augmented reality project where people can use their phones and go to locations to unlock these stories, like Wing On Wo, the oldest store in Chinatown that became a nonprofit cultural art space, and a store still. And so people could kind of unlock these stories. The last movie theater that is now a hotel. And then we started to visualize this in an interactive map form. So if you use the app, you would hear stories, you would see stories, and you would see the changes, right? So this is what it is now. Again, a hotel, an expensive hotel. It was the last movie theater in Chinatown. Or 50 Bari, which was the first, this is now this huge hotel owned by the Chu family, which they're large gentrifiers. A large developer, one of the largest developers in Chinatown. But it was the first unionized restaurant, Silver Palace, in 1980. And so kind of unlocking these stories. And then our most recent work is really against the jail that's being built by Center Street and on White Street, actually. And it's going to be the largest jail, tallest jail in the world at 40 stories. And so we early on started to call out the Museum of Chinese in America because they accepted $35 million in return for as a concession, a community concession. And they gave their basically blessing for the jail. They wouldn't frame it that way, of course. But as we know, MoCA, the museum has radical roots when they first started in 1980. And it's just it's so shameful that they just took this money and all this work of like talking about social justice during 2020, Black Lives Matter, yet they still were insistent in taking this money for their museum. And this is where the jail will be 40 stories high in Chinatown, replacing another jail that's there called the Tombs. They've knocked that down already. Construction has started. And originally the plans were that the museum was going to be on the bottom floor of the jail, which is what this sketch is. But then they decided they were going to buy their own space. So think about the dystopian kind of picture here of a jail where human beings are in cages, and then you've got this museum on the ground floor. That was crazy. So these are just some pictures from the protest, various protests in front of MoCA. People can bring these stories to life. Sorry, this should have been, and the other these slides should have been with the other slides of the map, but we, you know, some of the other things we've done is producing stories for tenants where they're telling other tenants in Chinese, like, this is what to expect when you go to housing court. And so the Know Your Rights, Know Your Tenant Rights videos, which were really have been really helpful. And this is from a New York Times article about the work that we were doing around around Asian American groups that were doing work around combating bias and anti-Asian violence. But for us, what we were doing is talking about the longstanding history of Black and Asian solidarity. Particularly, we were really trying to show the perspective that is so underrepresented in the mainstream media, which is that Asian Americans do not want more cops on the streets. We do not believe in putting people in the cages, and we are seeing this anti-jail work through an abolition perspective, because the NIMBY work, the NIMBY voices are very loud, representing the landlord class, right? But that we were very adamant about putting our perspective out there. And so that's what we've been doing in this work. This was something that we did in 2021 with the Red Canary song, with the Asian American feminist group, and a whole host of other folks in this teach-in that we did with the WOW Project. Last thing, this is actually the last thing, I promise, moms. The Borough-Based Liberation Project, which I know Bandung had a dinner at in September, and this was a very temporary project that we did. But literally across the street from where we set up our storefront is the Community Construction Liaison Office. So this office is supposed to be the community affairs office, quote unquote, where people could come in and be convinced why this jail is good for the community, how there'll be jobs for people, blah, 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 all this stuff. It's never opened. But so we riffed off of that. And so across the street, literally, we opened this office that we call the Borough-Based Liberation Project. And theirs is the Department of Design and Construction. That's part of the Department of Corrections. Our department that we created was the Department of Abolitionist Futures. And so literally people were confused because the idea was to confuse you, but that our space was a liberatory space, connecting all the issues around land and the displacement and gentrification and Palestine and militarism. And hundreds of people literally were coming to the space and saying, thank you. We need the space where we're looking at this through a holistic lens. And the jail is right around the corner from this space, which is an immigrant social services space called Storefront for Ideas. And they share a wall with the new jail. Like the actual building trembles when construction is happening around the corner. And so we did this month-long programming. We had panels. People did art making workshops. This is a collaging workshop where Chris Dang, who led this workshop, brought archives from the history of resistance in Chinatown, and people created, like, new and old and magazines, and people created these really beautiful collages. Sorry, the pictures are not great. Then literally they had 20 minutes to create these collages. And so they were collaging from the archives of resistance in Chinatown. There were kids workshops connecting all of the issues. This is a bunch of kids who are talking about connecting the issues around climate justice and ecology and what's happening with the environment here and Palestine. And so they became very kind of full in the sense that people were coming up with ideas of what they wanted to do. And we're like, sure, let's make it happen. This is a audio storytelling workshop where people told stories about Chinatown that would be added to a map. Of course, the Bandung panel, basically, past residents who were on a panel talking about their work, because we really, really wanted to center, again, the work where we're looking at the history of Black and Asian solidarity that didn't just start, during this last 10 years or during Black Lives Matter, but that goes way back. And then again, just more pictures around, like, we had an abolition kind of quiet space, a library, and we had an interactive space, we had an exhibition space. And this is just more install images. And we did an open call that A4 got the word out for. Thank you for doing that. And we had like so many submissions. We were super shocked by this. So this little tiny space that we had, we were able to display the abolition focused work submissions that we received. And then we had performances, and this performance was you know, we don't want that. We don't want it's based on, you know, the song that like we don't want the brick house song, you know, my brain is starting to disintegrate. But anyway, they rewrote the lyric.
Betty, you may have froze for just a moment. I'm gonna stop your video for you and then maybe you'll come back.
Behind us
There you
where
go.
we threw seed bombs. And so, and then this is the last day with the actions we did. So I will stop there.
Oh, sorry. I was trying to help
No,
you with your
please.
internet. So, and I,
No, we're sorry. I know I talked, I yapped a lot. I will stop talking.
no, you're good.
Please stop sharing. And then and then last thing I'll just say is I won't show the photos, but we did, in Seattle and in Philly, we've collaborated with some groups there and did projections with them as well. Because we're part of a group called, it's called Sea to Sea Chinatowns, Coast to Coast Chinatowns Against Displacement. And through that work, we've collaborated with groups in Philly and Seattle, and their respective Chinatowns to do projection, you know, work with participants and work with folks to tell their stories and then project the material with them. And so all of this was in partnership with the groups on the ground. So I'll just stop there. Sorry, I know that was a lot.
No problem. Your video froze for a second, so then I stopped the video and now it's perma stopped, it seemed. But I just wanted to leave one last some time for maybe one last question from the bigger group before winnowing down to just residents. So if anyone has a question, Mix, I saw you have one, but we'll address that one when we go down to just the residents only. But if anyone else has a question, feel free to chat it in the Q&A now, or we will ask you to please exit, and then we will continue on the conversation with our Bandung residents. So I'll give you a minute, everyone. And during that time, we will get your video back up, Betty. Thank you so much for such a in-depth chat, though. We really appreciated all the projects and collaborations that you've done. It's been so informative.
Thank you. I know it's a lot. So, I mean, feel free to email me if you have questions. I can put my email in the chat, or maybe you can pass it on to folks. Yeah. I'm not even sure who's here.
Yeah.
Yeah, if people are interested, they can reach out and we can share the slides and we can share your contact information. So thank you so much, Betty. Really appreciate it. It's always great to hear about your projects.
Thank you.